Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this talk on the problematics of national representation at the Venice Biennale. Why do I use the word problematics? That is because the Venice Biennial was actually set up in 1895. It's, as most of you know, the oldest biennial in the world, and it was established at the time of the heyday of the nation state. Now, 120 years later, the world has changed, and definitions of nationality, national identity, and nationhood have, of course, changed with them. But funnily enough, the format and the methodology of most national representations in Venice hasn't changed, which is rather strange, in my opinion. So this is what I'm going to talk about today, about these problematics, about how it's done and how I think it should be done. And I will also present two case studies, two pavilions that I've curated in Venice. In 2011, the Danish Pavilion, and in 2015, the Belgian Pavilion. And I'm neither Danish nor Belgian, I have to say. So that already says something about the fact that these two projects were rather unorthodox. I find it very, very problematic in this day and age to select artists on the basis of their passport in places such as the Venice Biennale. And I think it's also very important to distinguish between national and nationalistic. So when I talk about national representation the way that I understand it, it's something that has to do with nation, but not necessarily nationalism. These two projects that I'm going to talk about today actually attempted to rethink the notion of what constitutes a national representation in Venice. And in my view, what should be talked about within the context of the Venice Biennale is not an individual's nationality or origin, and that certainly shouldn't be a criteria, but questions that are pertinent to the country being represented. In terms of culture, politics, society, and what have you, whatever constitutes the national consciousness, if one can say that. I'd like to share this experience and to say that I attempted to do something that was rather unorthodox in the sense that most national pavilions in Venice, there are exceptions and the ones that I've done aren't the only ones, are still very much structured around the notion of the solo exhibition, by a singular artist, very often a male artist, though this has changed quite a lot in recent years, whose time has somehow come. I can imagine committees of people around rooms saying, okay, well, who shall we select this year? Well, yes, this person, maybe that person hasn't had enough exposure, and he's 50 years old, and yes, and if he doesn't do it now, he's never going to get the chance to do it, so let's select him. And I think, of course, this is a mistake. The other problem, I think, in Venice that we are all faced with as curators and as spectators is the fact that because there are so many national pavilions nowadays, over 90, the original 30 in the Giardini, here they are. The first one was established in 1907, and the most recent one was the Australian one, which actually knocked down its old pavilion in 2015 and built a new pavilion. But these are the original pavilions in the Giardini, and as you can see, they're almost like an archipelago of embassies. And they function very much as embassies. And what do I mean by that? I mean that very often what one sees in Venice are very politically correct presentations, very safe. No one's toes want to get stepped on because countries do consider these as part of their cultural diplomacy. And another thing, of course, that I think is very, very important to mention is that Venice is the best possible of all worlds to do a project, and also the worst possible of all worlds. And that is because there is such an inflation of both art and artists and projects that in terms of spectatorship, as we understand it, and I understand spectatorship as something that involves the deceleration of perception, it becomes very, very challenging. So what do most national pavilions do? They try to scream as loud as they can. And this often results in presentations that are rather spectacular, sometimes even bordering on the kitsch, and kind of, one-liners that are there to create an effect of the moment, but don't really leave very much after that. So I'll start by talking about the Danish Pavilion. This is a very funny image, parenthesis. All of us in the art world consider Venice somewhat of a sacred space, and I do believe that Venice Biennale would cease to exist if it wasn't in Venice. You know, as much as we like to critique it, we're all running to Venice at the first opportunity because we all love being there. And of course, the Venice Biennial itself is a kind of sanctified organization. This image here is rather interesting. It's taken at a time when there is no Biennale on. And I think it's very, very indicative of how La Biennale, the organization of the Biennale, is thinking about the Giardini and the national pavilions outside the time of the Venice Biennial. Speech Matters, which is the exhibition that I curated in 2011. I'll start with an anecdote. When I was appointed curator of this project, it was based on invitation. A total of 5 curators from all over the world were asked to submit a project for the exhibition. And after I was appointed and the news broke, everyone I ran into didn't ask me what I'm going to do, you know, which artists I'm going to show. They all ask me, how come you're curating the Danish Pavilion? And that is because I'm not Danish, I'm Greek, and it already seems rather strange that someone who is a curator not representing that particular country is actually called upon to speak on behalf of that country. So of course I explained the procedure, and I was asked to respond to 4 criteria. One was that the exhibition should have a global perspective. The other was that it should give rise to debate, and that it should be considered innovative. And finally, and most interestingly enough, the primary criterion was that it should challenge the notion of what constitutes a national representation. And this is what I kind of grabbed myself on. And I decided to do a group exhibition with 18 artists, 17 new productions, and only 2 Danish artists. Why do I say this? Because of course I got criticized by the Danish right-wing press for not having enough Danish artists in the show. And I decided to commit what a fellow curator and mentor that I had when I started out told me when I first visited the Venice Biennale in the late 1990s. And he said to me, if you do a group exhibition in Venice, you will be committing curatorial suicide. So I decided to commit curatorial suicide by making this group exhibition. And the exhibition was called Speech Matters. And that is, of course, a title that has a double meaning. It was about freedom of speech and all the complicated issues around it. And it was a subject that I chose because I considered it of particular relevance to the Danish context. It is, of course, very relevant for an international context as well, but as Denmark has been one of the countries that somehow experienced the trauma of free speech following the 2006 Danish cartoon scandal, and this in a very open society which has had one of the highest traditions of free press in the world, there's been a lot of regression in relation to how we understand the concept of free speech. And of course I decided to work with this subject because I think it is a very, very relevant subject. It was relevant at the time and it still is very relevant now because it affects a very broad range of issues, from the personal and the political to the cultural and the social, and it touches upon such a huge gamut of hugely important issues such as religion, democracy, human rights, civil rights, etc., etc. And of course freedom of speech also affects many other things, such as questions of censorship, increasing control of the media, surveillance, political correctness, which is of course the new a new form of self-censorship, hate speech, freedom of the internet, privatization of knowledge, and of course public space. And not least of which also private matters, such as matters of gender and sexual orientation and lifestyle preferences. So I felt it was high time that there was a considered debate about this very, very contested issue, which unfortunately is so very often polarized in the media. When we talk about freedom of speech, it's very often a case of them or us, Islam and Christianity, the West and the global South, or the Occident. And of course, what is an incredible paradox, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this, is that the right wing has actually also kind of embraced freedom of speech as its rallying model and as its battleground. And of course, this is very problematic. So this exhibition came, in fact, in the wake of the Danish cartoon scandal, but was not about the Danish cartoon scandal. It was about this very, very complex and subjective issue of what is freedom of speech. For there is no definition of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech actually depends on where you're standing, what cultural, social, or political point of view you carry, how you have grown up, in what kind of family and with what kind of education. Dealing with these questions of how does one define freedom of speech, and indeed, if freedom of speech has to be curtailed, who is the one to decide the limits of what can be said and cannot be said? And so the exhibition was intending to highlight these subjectivities and to also somehow dispel the myth of total free speech, which is again what the right wing seems to be saying today. There never has been a society where there has been total freedom of speech. Each speech act is an act of responsibility. We have to think before we talk, and what I say affects the person across from me. These are, of course, issues that are very often lost on politicians, and that's why I decided to invite 18 artists, many of whom came from countries where freedom of speech is still a very contested issue. This is the Danish Pavilion. There are two buildings, I'll explain about it. I'll intersperse my talk also with some anecdotes. When I was appointed, I was invited to go to a meeting to the Ministry of Culture in Denmark to discuss the finances of the exhibition. And I was told that I had about 450,000 euros at hand in order to organize the exhibition and 160,000 euros for new productions. And the next question was, what is my bank account number? Because they wanted to transfer the funds to my personal account. And of course I was horrified at this prospect, and I refused. But why am I saying this? I'm saying this because the Danish case is, I would say, an exceptional case in how they organize the pavilion. First of all, they give the curator a carte blanche in terms of artistic content. And second of all, they're mad enough to trust the curator to give them over €500,000 euros in their personal bank account. I would have never, of course, taken this responsibility. And so I insisted that there should be a budget manager and a financial manager. But this is the context of openness and freedom that I had the privilege to work in. At the same time, the second question that I asked them was, is there a quota? It's a Danish national representation in Venice. Is there a quota for Danish artists? And they said to me, no, there is no quota for Danish artists. And in fact, if you don't want to have any Danish artists, you don't have to. Of course, I thought that would be pretty much of an empty political statement if I did that. And there were 2 Danish artists. And apart from that, it was a pretty smooth ride. Apart from a very, very thorny case involving censorship, which I'll talk about. And now I'll just take you, I won't of course talk about the whole exhibition, nor indeed all of the artists, because we have about an hour at hand, and I don't like seeing people fall asleep. But I'll start with this work here, which was a special commission for the pavilion, which was very interesting because by the time it was actually made, it looked as if it had been there forever. And it's by a Greek artist called Stelios Faitakis, who does something rather brave, I have to say. As you know, we have a tradition of icon painting in Greece, which very few contemporary artists dare to touch because it's so, of course, charged. And Stelios works with this tradition of Byzantine icon painting, but what he does is that he invests this iconography with a contemporary narrative. So what you see here is a work called Imposition Symphony, which was a kind of narrative in several chapters of very, very contested moments involving freedom of speech issues, from book burnings in 1930s Germany to Mao's famous dictum, "Let 100 flowers flowers bloom when he asked all the intellectuals of China to come forth and express their opinion about the regime, and then proceeded, of course, to purge all of them and instigate the Cultural Revolution. So here is Mao with his 100 flowers. And this is the preparation of the work. And another interesting anecdote is that this is a work that is entirely handmade. It was made by the artist and his brother and one other assistant. They worked for over a month on this project. And at that time, the American Pavilion, which is right across from the Danish Pavilion, had the exhibition of Alora and Calzadilla. I don't know if you remember this, but it was a very noisy upside-down tank. And on top of the tank, it was a former Korean military tank that was turning, so it was making a tremendous noise. And I thought this was such an interesting cultural metaphor. A small country like Denmark, featuring an artist from a small country like Greece who is working by hand, and on the other hand, the classic Duchampian ready-made and this kind of military power coming from the United States of America. And this was a kind of very nice coincidence, I have to say. The scenography was done by an artist, not an architect, Tilman Wendland, and this was a conscious decision. And here are some of the other artists in it. So Taryn Simon from the United States, also Sharon Hayes, Agency from Belgium, and Zhang Dali from China. This is Taryn Simon's An American Index of the Hidden and Unfamiliar, which is a fascinating photographic project where she ventured into various spaces that never see the light of day and are never really represented. So from plants where nuclear waste disposal is conducted, to Smith & Wesson gun factory producing, and all of these things that never really see the light of day. Agency, which is actually the project of Kobe Matisse, a Brussels-based artist, who it's a performative project, and it's also a project involving a lot of research and copyright matters. Copyright matters that actually relate to the dichotomy between nature and culture in terms of when something is claimed by someone. So sometimes it's a person or a corporation that claims something, and very often there's an image, and this happens also very often in artistic practice. So you went into the pavilion, and each box contains a contested copyright case, and it's a performative work where there was a person there and would bring the object down on the table and talk about the legal case involving the dispute. Zhang Dali's Second History is a 10-year project, research project, where he looked into how media images were censored during the reign of Mao in China, and this of course was at the time where there was no Photoshop, and so kind of very interesting nuances in juxtapositions between the two pictures. Tala Madani, a painter from Iran, who made a body of work that talks about what happens when language collapses. And of course, what happens when language collapses is that you have violence and you have situations of precarity. And in this body of work, men become alphabet, and they enact various performative roles about what happens and what the consequences are when language collapses. This is a work by a Dutch artist, Han Hogebrugge, who made a music video involving 4 different personalities, all of whom talked about free speech issues from a different perspective. Wendelin van Oldenborg, who is actually happily representing Holland this year at the Dutch Pavilion, and an artist I've worked with for many years. And Robert Crumb, the American illustrator, with an older work from 1993. Now, I have to say that this is the work that I really expected would create an uproar in Venice, because it was the most politically incorrect work in the exhibition. But for me, it felt very necessary to test the limits of this idea of freedom of speech and not to play it safe. And as Robert Crumb is one of those artists who really takes freedom of speech to extremes, exercising full and total freedom of speech, he made this cartoon called When the Niggers Take Over America, and it imagines a rather nightmarish scenario in which black people in the form of sort of African dictators come to take over America. Funnily enough, this work didn't create any fuss at all. Another work did, and I'll say which one it is. This was the starting point of the pavilion. Jan Schwankmajer, a very famous and historic, seminal experimental Czech filmmaker, who in 1968 made a film called The Garden, a very brave film because he was censored and he wasn't allowed to make his work in Czechoslovakia. And it involves a rather surrealistic story in which two people, old friends. One is a kind of obviously a party boss, a member of the governing nomenclatura, and his friend who is an unsuspecting victim. And they go on a drive into the countryside, and they arrive at a villa belonging, of course, to the official, and they find the villa surrounded by a human fence. And so they proceed to unlock the villa, and what happens, in fact, is the friend finds all this very, very strange, but ultimately ends up being a part of the human fence, the human chain. And of course that talks about very much about how subjugation works, and of course what happens when you decide to self-censor yourself. This is the Danish Pavilion. As you can see, there's two buildings. The one on the left is the neoclassical building that was built in the 1930s, and there was a modernist edition built in the 1960s. And I decided to make a third pavilion, which was made by Thomas Kilper, a German artist, and the pavilion was called the Pavilion for Revolutionary Free Speech. And it was an open pavilion. I think this was very important for me to have an open space, because all of these pavilions in Venice are kind of somehow sanctified, very closed spaces. And so what Thomas did is he created this open pavilion, and Thomas is very well known for his woodcuts. And he created a huge woodcut on the floor, and what one could see on it was a portrait gallery of many, many figures who represent rather extremist political views, from Pia Kjærsgaard, who was at the time the leader of the Danish People's right-wing party, to Berlusconi, to Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the head of NATO, and various other people who hold rather I would say problematic viewpoints. And so you could actually walk on this, and at the same time we turned this space into a discursive space where we had 2 months of conferences, lectures, and discussions, of course, about freedom of speech. And this is the work that actually created the most fuss. A lot of people who visited it, including the director of the Biennale, Paolo Barata, felt very, very uncomfortable. And the Danish press picked it up and started saying that it's not possible to spend public money and to have the faces of our politicians trampled on. And of course, this was not at all the object of the exercise. But anyway, I think the good thing was that a great deal of debate was generated. And it's also, for me, it was very interesting to create a space of contestation in the context of the Venice Biennale, which is very often very politically correct and very culturally diplomatic and safe. And there was also a speaker's corner, so if people wanted to exercise a free speech act, they could, and a series of performances on the speaker's corner. This was a beautiful, more ephemeral project by Irene Anastase and René Gabri, who traveled to the Arab countries that experienced the Arab Spring and sought out people who had spoken up for themselves in regimes which at the time were still very fragile, and of course they still are, and they collected stories and also did a drawing piece and an audio piece. And before I conclude the Danish Pavilion, I should say that there was one sticking point. And the sticking point was this artist here, Johannes af Tafsheden. Johannes af Tafsheden is a pseudonym for an artist who wanted to remain anonymous. And this artist wanted to remain anonymous for a very specific reason. The reason was that, of course, freedom of speech and freedom of expression is a fundamental component of all artistic practice. And for some artists, of course, it's a natural thing to be able to express themselves freely, and for some artists, depending on where they come from, this is not the case. And this is the point that Johannes af Taftsheden wanted to make. And so he or she, as the case may be, decided to do a project that would be unknown to everyone, including myself. And when I put this to the International Visual Arts Committee of the Danish Arts Council that selected me, they said, we can't have this. We need to know who the artist is, and we need to know what the artist is going to do. And I said, I'm afraid that's not possible, because the conditions of this artist's participation are these, and this is an artist I really want to have in the show. And they said, we're very sorry. If we don't know who it is, then he cannot be in the show. And I said, well, I hope you realize that you're putting yourself in a very, very difficult political position, because this is an exhibition about freedom of speech, and you have given me carte blanche to do what I want. So if you censor me, you're fundamentally torpedoing the entire principle of this pavilion. And of course, it was a very strong argument, and we managed to reach a compromise where I only told one person who the artist was, but the project indeed remained secret until the opening, also to me. And what it was, or what it turned out to be, and I don't think that this was the intention, but I think this whole episode, which was very well documented through many emails, Johannes af Taftsheden, Johannes of Ceylon, the pseudonym of Søren Kierkegaard, decided to ask two of the artists participating in the pavilion, Irene Anastase and René Gabri, who you can see here, who were participating with another work, to, in fact, do a series of readings which revealed the entire correspondence we had over months about this contested issue. And this I did not know about, but it was no problem because my position was very, very clear from the beginning, and that is what the project was. And of course, a very, very delicate ephemeral note in the pavilion, which kind of inferred to this. It's a very bad slide, I'm afraid. And then before I move on to talk about the Danish Pavilion, I just want to take a break and just read you something that is extremely funny. So I talked about the one thorny issue with Thomas Kilper's pavilion. I talked about Johannes af Taftsheden. That was the second hiccup. And the third hiccup that I had was with the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs has nothing to do with the selection of the Danish representation in Venice. But when they found out that the Ministry of Culture had selected a project on freedom of speech, they went haywire. And they called the Ministry of Culture and they said, are you absolutely insane? How could you select such a project after what happened in 2006 with the Danish cartoon scandal? We are very, very worried. We want to talk to the curator. We're fearing that there's going to be a scandal, that there might be trouble in Venice. They were seeing ghosts everywhere. I explained to them, first of all, that the exhibition was not about the Danish cartoon scandal and definitely not about Islam, but they were not to be put to rest. So I said, I'm happy to answer any questions that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs might have. So what they did was, to all credit, I have to say the Ministry of Culture supported me and stood by their choice, but they let the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs send me a questionnaire. And I dug it up this morning, and I'll just read you some of the questions. So, did Denmark learn nothing from the global Mohammed controversy? Is Denmark now recurring cultural value debate against Islam and Muslims all over the world? How come Denmark as a nation once again represents cartoons and other artworks that are condescending, offensive, and respectless to other nationalities with other cultures and religions? How come only 2 Danish artists are represented in the exhibition? Is this a national representation? How is this a Danish pavilion? How is it even called a national pavilion anymore? Why is the exhibition in the Danish Pavilion reproducing a stereotypical image of Islam as a fundamentalist religion that is oppressive to women, to the work of Tala Madani? Why is the exhibition in the Danish Pavilion being offensive towards the Afro-American community by exhibiting racist and sexist cartoons? It goes on and on and on. How can Denmark support and participate in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan as a US ally when the Danish Pavilion exposes American soldiers as rapists and murderers? This was the work of Taryn Simon. And it goes on and on and on and on. And I have to say, I had a tremendous amount of fun with these questions, and I answered them. And to me, of course, this was a very interesting example of how politicians see ghosts everywhere and how they themselves are also culpable for falling into this kind of polarized debate of understanding something as complex as freedom of speech as something that can be reduced to binary opposites. So anyway, all's well that ended well, and there were no scandals and no terrorists came to the pavilion. And to close, I should also mention this project because the Danish Pavilion that year also had a separate independent pavilion outside the Giardini on the island of San Servolo, a project by a Danish artist called Foss. And this was a real leap of faith because it looked like it wasn't possible to do this. It was a hugely ambitious project. As you can see, it's a floating pavilion. And to me, this was a very important project because if you consider the space of Venice, it is, by all intents and purposes, a quasi-private space. It's very expensive to get into the Giardini. The ticket costs 25 euros. Citizens of Venice don't get any discount. Students get a ridiculously small discount. So it still stays a fairly elitist space. And to me, this notion of the National Pavilion as an embassy, which also is a rather elitist adventure, is at odds with the idea of freedom of speech and open spaces. So we decided to instigate this project. And it was a pavilion called Oslo, where there were performances, a radio station, all sorts of debates and music sessions, and also a radio station. And everyone could go there for free, everyone could drink and pay whatever they wanted to pay. And so this was, in a way, the conclusion of this project. Okay, I've got 20 more minutes. Does anyone maybe have any questions before I continue? No questions? So here you can see what it looked like. And all the students from the University of Venice came, and it was just really wonderful. And it had the most fabulous view over the sunset in Venice. And I have to say this was my favorite part of the project. And this is the artist. And this is our little catalogue, which sold out in 1 month, and I wasn't allowed to reprint it because the Danish ministry was so happy that it became a collector's item. So, but there is a PDF if anyone wants one. So we can move on to part 2 of this talk, Belgian Pavilion, which I curated in 2015. This was a completely different adventure, also with a couple of hiccups. And the selection procedure for the Belgian pavilion is, of course, very different to many other national pavilions. Each national pavilion has its own way of selection, but the Belgian case is, of course, very, very particular because the pavilion is shared by the 2 communities, the French-speaking community and the Dutch-speaking community. Well, Flemish-speaking, to be more correct. And in this case, it was the turn of the Walloons of the French-speaking community, and they issued an open call. And normally I wouldn't participate in an open call, but Vincent Mason, the artist who finally was represented, an artist who I respect and have worked with for many, many years, came to me and said, Katerina, would you like to make a proposal together? And I said I'd be delighted to do that. And we came up with this project here, Personnes et les autres, Vincent Mason and guests. And I have to say that I'm very proud of this because I think it's the first pavilion in Venice that really broke with the tradition of Belgian national representation in Venice since 1907. The Belgian Pavilion was the first Venice to be built in Venice. And it was the first time that there was an international exhibition with 11 artists, and for the first time also artists from Africa, very symbolically. And here you can see the evolution of the Belgian Pavilion. So here is the 1907 building. It was built by King Leopold II, a year before his Congo Free State was handed over to the Belgian state, following an international uproar on his Congo policies. And so the pavilion basically took this history as its point of departure. Here you can see the evolution of the architecture. And this is what the pavilion looks like today, with the last intervention made in 1948. So we decided to really take this symbolic moment of like the fact that colonialism was, of course, something that defined Belgium, and that is something that is still not very much discussed in the public domain, particularly since King Leopold's reign was one of the most violent, and many historians are calling it a genocide. And we decided to deal, of course, with this legacy of colonial modernity. But I have to say that the exhibition was not a post-colonial exhibition. I think this is something that has been very much discussed. Post-colonial critique has been something that has been going on for more than 30 years. It did something very different. It also tried to address the idea of what constitutes a national representation. And to me, of course, dealing with marginalized histories that are put on the table in such a prominent way is one of the ways where one can deal with national representation. And again, this was, of course, an international exhibition with many artists from all over the world, all of which had an interest in colonial modernity. The criteria with which we selected the artists, because both Vincent and myself brought artists into the project, a lot of them were of course concerned with this issue of colonial modernity and the aftermath of colonialism, so the phantoms of colonialism which still persist today, and of course an interest in research-based practices, because as we're dealing with archives and history, and of course things that belong to the past and need to be excavated and resuscitated, most of the artists that were brought together had this common thread. Of course, it was the first time that this issue of colonial modernity was probed in such a major way, apart from, of course, the exhibition of Luc Tuymans, who represented Venice a couple of years ago. But this was in many ways a much more discursive exhibition. And of course, there was a critical aspect, but what we were more interested in doing is actually talking about the positive outcome of colonial encounters, because of course colonialism wasn't only about oppression, it wasn't only about subjugation, it was also about very fruitful encounters between artists and intellectuals throughout the 20th century, from the 1930s onwards. There's a second history that needs to be written, which is not one of colonial oppression. So this is what we decided to do. And we decided, of course, to kind of mine all these unknown adventures between intellectuals and artists. And so the point of departure wasn't so much this kind of idea of post-colonial critique, but more unearthing aspects and micro-histories of this unknown avant-garde throughout the 20th century. And basically this traced a timeline from Dada and Surrealism, where there was already an aller-retour between Africa and Europe, through to the Situationist International, the last major international avant-garde movement, which incidentally had its last conference in Venice in 1969, and one of the key, of course, practitioners and theorists of the Situationist International is a Belgian, Raoul van Eigem. He's still alive and well, and is also one of the reasons that Vincent made the work he did. And considering this, of course, backdrop of Belgium's role in the international avant-garde and also within certain activist practices, as very important in understanding the present, and of course the artistic avant-gardes of the 20th century. And at the same time, there was a kind of subtext, a red thread that connected, of course, all these artistic developments to the Situationist International as a radical movement, to Pan-Africanism, and to, of course, African independence movements and the civil rights movements. And of course, 1969 was the conference, last conference of the Situationist International. But also 1968 was a very, very important moment, not only in Europe, but also in Africa. And it's a moment that the pavilion referenced, because very few people know that apart from a May 1968 in Europe, in Paris specifically, there was also a May 1968 moment in Africa, and particularly in the Congo, in Kinshasa, where the students revolted against Mobutu, and there was a crushed uprising, and this has been completely rewritten out of the history books subsequently. So these are all kind of utopian moments that we wanted to refer to, and very quickly I'll take you through the exhibition. So Vincent's work, which was of course the cornerstone of the pavilion and the pivot as well. Vincent decided to work with a lost text that was written actually by Raoul Vaneigem in 1968, and this text actually well, actually, there's a story before that. I'll backtrack. Raoul found in his archives a text written by Joseph Mbelolo Yampiku. Now, the Situationist International, as an international art movement, had, of course, not only European and international members, it also had African members. It had Tunisian members, Congolese members, and Algerian members. And Joseph Mbelolo Yampiku was a student of Raoul Vaneigem at the university in Belgium. And at the time, to coincide with this uprising in 1968, he wrote a protest song, which Vincent found in the archives of Raoul. It was never realized. It laid in the archives for a year, and what Vincent actually decided to do was to turn this lost text into a song, into a rumba. And rumba, of course, as you all know, is one of the most important musical forms in Africa. It's a hybrid form because, of course, it started in Africa, it was exported by slaves to Cuba, and then re-imported back into Africa. And it was also a form of protest. Rumba has been traditionally associated with protest because, as of course protest movements, particularly during African dictatorships, were not of course very fruitful, one of the reasons and one of the ways that people protested was through music. And so Vincent basically filmed this song. It was produced by Vincent Kenis, who is one of the most well-known producers of Congotronics, and it was filmed in a legendary nightclub called the 1-2-3 in Kinshasa, which was the nightclub that was set up in the 1970s by Franco Luambo Makiadi, who is the undisputed king of rumba. Sadly, he passed away, but his legacy in Congo and in Africa is enormous. So it was a musical piece, and a very moving one at that, because Vincent managed to track down Joseph Mbelolo Yampiku, who appears, of course, in the film and sings together with the musicians, and of course recounts his experience as being a key member of the African Situationists, and of course of this key moment of 1968. And this is an installation view of the pavilion with Vincent's work. And I'll talk about some of the artists, not all of them. Mathieu Cleyebe Abonanc, who made a photographic and sculptural project based on a statue that one finds very, very often in the French Antilles. This particular one was a statue by Ernest Louis Barriat, a 19th century neoclassical sculptor, and what it depicts is a very famous 19th century statesman Victor Schulcher. Victor Schulcher was actually responsible for furthering the abolition of slavery in France. And here you can see him in this statue, in this very grandiose gesture, sort of liberating a black slave. And what Mathieu decided to do is kind of to provide an alternative reading of this image, one that kind of somehow operates on a slightly different level, slightly homoerotic, and a level which actually talks about a different kind of relationship, one where the reciprocity is perhaps a little bit more obvious than in a frontal kind of viewing of the sculpture. And so it was a very discreet presentation with these images here, and a cast of the statue that is in a museum in French Guyana. Sami Balogi, Congolese artist based in Brussels, who showed two projects. This project, which is an existing project, Essay on Urban Planning, which juxtaposes aerial views of the city of Lubumbashi with images from the museum featuring tropical insects and mosquitoes. And it's a comparative project which looks into how tropical medicine was actually used as a pretext by the colonial power to segregate the population. And what happened is that there was a radius, a cordon sanitaire, as we say, of 500 square meters between blacks and whites in urban planning at the time. And that was because 500 meters is the actual span, maximum span of the mosquito, the malaria-carrying mosquito. So, of course, hygiene was used as, of course, a pretext to segregate populations. And then there was a second work that Sami made, which is also a kind of comparative project. And it links together the practice of Belgian secret services throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, particularly in the run-up to independence, with the ancient African tradition of scarification. And of course, before colonialism, Congo was an agglomeration of many, many different tribes, each of which had their own scarification rituals. And scarification rituals are, of course, initiation rituals in Africa. But during the time of the independence movement, they also became incredibly politicized, because many of these tribes were actually rising up against the Belgians. And so the Belgian secret services were actually surveying many of these secret sects who, of course, also practice scarification. And here is, of course, a document. Our partner was the Royal Museum for Central Africa in Tervuren, so many of the artists were allowed to do research there. And this is a report from a chef de sécurité in the Bukavu province who was looking into a tribe called the Bulangi. And so what Sami did is he made this installation here, and he made it in copper. And of course, copper refers to the huge extraction. Congo is one of the most copper-rich countries in the world. And of course, there have been many, many black laborers who worked for the colonial powers. And so he cast this scarification patterns into copper. And of course, this is a very, very symbolic action, because it talks about the labor of black bodies in copper extraction. This is an incredibly complex and fascinating project, and I'll try to explain it in a few words, although it's not easy. James Beckett, an artist from Zimbabwe, who started with this image, which is, as you can see, a businessman sitting on top of a mountain of billiard balls made in ivory. But of course, as all the elephants were killed, effectively, billiard balls could no longer be produced in ivory and had to be produced in a synthetic plastic called bakelite, which incidentally was also invented by a Belgian. And this connected to this piece here by Jacques Carelman, Tachinoidal Landscape from 1970. Jacques Carelman, and here you can begin to see how the pieces of the puzzle fall together in this project. Jacques Carelman was also one of the key illustrators for the May 1968 protest posters. And James connected this image with this image here. What you see here is an automatic storage retrieval system that you find in very big corporations like Amazon when they have to, of course, search and deliver packages, but also pharmacies. And he connected this automated robotic system with the legacy of modernism in Africa. Africa has an extraordinarily rich legacy of modernist buildings. A lot of the leaders of newly independent nations in Africa imported modernist architects in order to build their new state. But of course it was a very different version of modernism than that which we have in Europe, and it was adapted, of course, for tropical use. And so what James did is he created an archive of practically all of the iconic modernist buildings in Africa. You can see them here. So each one had a number and was inferred by these building blocks, which were actually invented by the brother of Frank Lloyd Wright, John Lloyd Wright. And the result is this. Negative space, a scenario generator for clandestine building in Africa. And what it is that this robot, this machine, actually picked out each case study. But what you saw was not a maquette of the actual building, but a maquette of the negative space in between the unused spaces of the building. And so it talks about, of course, how this kind of very internationalist model of architecture is appropriated by inhabitants within, of course, a very different geographical context. And here you can see some of the details. So this was constantly working. And this is another project which was also done in collaboration with the Royal Museum for Central Africa in Tervuren. And to me, it's one of the most moving projects in the pavilion. It's by an Italian artist, Elisabetta Benassi. And it's an homage to this figure here, this young man, Paul Panda Farnana. Paul Panda Farnana was born in Banana, in the Congo, and was brought back to Belgium in the 1890s by the wife of a colonial administrator who fell in love with this young man. And he was the first Congolese to be educated, to receive a higher education in Belgium. And he was also involved in the first Pan-African and second Pan-African Congress in London and in Brussels. And he was one of the first Congolese who actually was involved as an activist in drawing attention to the plight of the Congolese in the Congo. But he's been completely rewritten out of history. And this is the initial research that Elisabetta did in an absolutely fascinating place here in Mons called the Mundaneum. I don't know if anyone knows about this incredible legacy that we have in Belgium, but the Mundaneum was a project, an incredibly utopian project of two Belgians, Paul Otlet and Henri Lafontaine, two very wealthy but very visionary individuals who decided to create a library for all knowledge, and also wanted to create an international city for peace where all this knowledge would be, of course, stored. And Paul Otlet was very important because he developed the decimal classification index, which is the basis of the old American library system. But he was also the precursor of the internet. And I urge you to draw attention to this image here, because this is an image from the 1930s. And you can see how he already conceived of the internet before Tim Berners-Lee. And so Elisabetta Benassi did the research in the Mundaneum and in the Royal Museum of Central Africa. Here you can see the bones of exotic animals and their classification system. And what she did was she made this, a tribute to Mfumu, which was Paul Panda Farnana's African name. And it's a tram stop. It's an imaginary tram stop, a ghost tram stop made out of the bones of these exotic animals, casts of the bones. And it refers to the following. When King Leopold first set up his museum for Africa, it was actually housed in the Parc de Cinquantenaire for the World Exposition in 1897. And then the museum was finally moved to its current location in Tervuren. And there is a tram line that connects the Cinquantenaire to, of course, the Royal Museum of Central Africa. And Elisabeta's proposal was that on this tram line, which of course has been tainted with blood and contested histories, there needs to be a space for a tribute to this individual, this Congolese individual that has been written out of art history. So it's kind of a very phantomic and kind of bizarre structure that recalls, of course, the presence of Mfumu. And during the opening, we had performances where there were readings taking place from Mark Twain's King Leopold's soliloquy, which was also another damning text on King Leopold's legacy. This was a performative piece by Patrick Bernier and Olive Martin, and it's actually a variant of chess. As we all know, chess is a very oppositional game. When you play and you claim a pawn, the pawn exits. And here they developed a chess game where during the play, if a pawn is claimed, it doesn't exit the game, but it actually becomes a hybrid. It's a métissage of the game, and it continues to play. So, of course, it's a metaphor on métissage, on the concept of métissage, and, of course, on oppositional strategy. And it's based on the color symbolism of this picture that you can see, this photograph, which was a military march in Niger in 1960, and Patrick's grandfather was, of course, also a colonial official at the time, and so it's a kind of personal archive that he translated together with Olive into this kind of very strange, never-ending chess game. I don't know if I'm going too fast. And I think I'll skip this one because I'm just looking at my watch. Yes, I'll wrap this up. Maybe by talking about Mariam Jaffrey, whose work is also research-based and who looked into the question of who owns key moments of national definition, images of key moments of national definition. And she conducted research into the archives of private image banks such as Getty and Corbis, and compared those with national image banks in African countries, and discovered that very often the very same image is claimed by two different parties. And of course, it's a work that talks about the privatization of knowledge and, of course, copyright, and who decides, who has the ownership of these deciding moments of national identity. So this is Queen Elizabeth dancing with the new president of Ghana, the first country that got independence in 1957, and so on and so forth. And there's, of course, key explanatory texts underneath. And Adam Pendleton, last artist in the exhibition, who developed a new installation for the pavilion, which brought together his fictional Black Dada movement. And Black Dada, in fact, imagines what Dada would be like if, of course, it was invented by black artists, and brings together the whole history of Dada and, of course, minimalism. Many of these works reference Solowit's Incomplete Open Cube, and turns into an incredibly hybrid work that weaves together references from African independence, iconic references of African independence, and works of art, seminal works of primitive art that were, of course, co-opted appropriated, if I may say, also by many Dada and Surrealist artists. And this image here, which is a wallpaper of the collection of Walter Arensberg, a collection which is one of the most important collections of primitive art in the United States. And here you can see all these references that I have been talking about from the beginning, from Dada and Surrealism to Cobra, and to, of course, present day contemporary artistic production. And I think I will put a full stop there. It's already a lot of information to take in. Thank you. I don't know if you have any questions. I guess you can now infer how I understand the notion of a national representation, and it will be interesting to see what will happen in Venice this year. And there are always, of course, surprises, and there are always a handful of pavilions that somehow test these limits. But let's see. Any questions? None at all. Objections? Well, anyway, thank you very much for being here.